Thank you to my friends over on Patreon. I appreciate your continued support. Hi, welcome to our Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm delighted to be joined by two former guests, Paul Vander Klay and Alec Ryrie. Paul is a popular YouTuber and pastor in the USA. Alec is an historian, author, and speaker. In the past, Paul and I have spoken a number of times. We've got to spend some wonderful times together in Ireland and America. Alec and I spoke once previously about his work on Protestants and the making of the modern world, his book on doubt, atheism, and more. Today, however, I'd love to look at Alec's recent book, The Age of Hitler and How We'll Survive It. So I'd be keen to hear some of Paul's thoughts about the book, any questions that he has for Alex, and of course to hear a little bit more about Alec's thesis and perhaps again some questions of his own. So I suppose first of all, gents, I know you both have a lot of obligations. So what moved you to have this conversation at all? If it might start with you, Paul.
Well, I've long been on a quest to understand the implicit religions of my people, my family, myself, my nation. And not too long ago, Rusty Reno sort of broke some things open when he talked about the post-war consensus. And that sort of got my mind turning. I'd already been sort of trying to, my YouTube channel is just me trying to figure things out in many ways and then having conversations with people. And and so I'd always been fascinated by the Second World War. I was born in '63. I read Guadalcanal Diaries, all these World War II things, always fascinated by it. And then Rusty Reno's thesis really got me thinking. And then when I heard Alec's thesis on the age of Hitler, a whole bunch of things just sort of clicked. Clicked in terms of what I've seen of people leaving the Christian faith or the Christian church, or sometimes maintaining their presence in it, but their passionate assumptions being very much lined up with a good many other people and things in the secular realm. As we've seen in North America, the people's allegiance have become increasingly political and polarized, partly due to the advent of Donald Trump. And I just found Alex, I heard a couple of podcasts where he talked about the book, and then I read the book, and now I'm reading his book on unbelief and doubt, which I'm also finding tremendously helpful. So I just really appreciated the work that Alec is doing. And so anybody who knows me knows that once I find something that's interesting, I tend to dig. And so this is part of the digging.
Wonderful, thanks, Paul. And what would you say, Alec?
Well, I drifted into this kind of by accident. I'm supposed to be a historian of the Reformation era and what follows it. So I've really got no business writing a book about the 20th century. And people have suggested to me that by writing a book with the word Hitler in the title, I'm just trying to shift some copies, which I'm shocked by that idea. Uh, but I mean, maybe in some ways that is the point. I mean, this it goes back to your phrase just now, Paul, implicit religion. The perspective. Okay, if I've got an excuse as a historian of a different age for writing about this, it's that looking at the modern era through the perspective of older times does help you to see it in a different way. You know, it helps you to see the water that we're swimming in. And it's those kinds of deep assumptions, the implicit religions of our age, which are so hard for us to see because we're too close to them. Um, and the once you have seen it, the centrality of World War II and of the struggle against Nazism for our whole worldview and values, or at least for the values that we've lived in for most of our lives. Um, it's hard to unsee this. It's just such a fundamental fact of the of our era. So in some ways, it's not really something that I try to argue for in the book. I It seems to me that once you've uh, framed it in the way that I've had it framed for me, it's kind of self-evident that this is just a description of the world we live in. If there was a particular moment in my research that kind of opened me up to this. I mean, you mentioned just now, Paul, my earlier book, Unbelievers. This kind of spans the two. It was reading a really interesting book, a book that I disagree with profoundly, but I think it's wrong in such a kind of fruitful and interesting way. And I mean, the world is full of kind of tediously right books, oh, to be that fruitfully and interestingly wrong. Anyway, this is a book called Becoming Atheist by Callum Brown, who's a Scottish historian of secularization. He himself is very much a card-carrying humanist, a proper kind of tub-thumping campaigner. But what he did for this book was conduct a series of long form interviews with over 80 people from different countries who had consciously embraced an atheist identity in midlife. And I think the picture that he assembles from them is really interesting. And the point that really struck me from them is in the chapter where he talks about values. And he says that these people they all describe embracing a pretty similar set of ethics. And it's your classic modern secular set of ethics based around, you can see that there's a Christian inheritance in there, that the golden rule is fundamental. But then they're also embracing a series of principles about bodily and sexual autonomy. That kind of strong insistence on individual independence is driving it. We're familiar with this. And what he points out is that none of these people were converted to this. There wasn't a campaigning organization out there. There wasn't a manifesto that they signed up to. Their own experience is that this was something that they discovered within themselves individually and then embraced. And he says this is because this is the natural condition of humanity, and they've discovered the underlying fundamental truth, which is kind of cute because it's you do not have to be a profound historian to realize this is, in terms of human history, a really unusual set of beliefs. And so I thought, he thinks this is the fundamental atheist truth that's emerging. Okay, we can discount that, I think. But it does show that there's something really profound. There's something in the water that is deep in our shared culture. And when you look at what those values are, what they define themselves by, what they define themselves against, it's that doctrine of human rights which emerges out of World War II. Those values are kind of the inverse of Nazism. And of course, they're close enough to traditional Christian values that the leap from one to another isn't disorientating. And I mean, one of the things that he describes, I mean, quite movingly in places in this book is people who are trying to hold their new secular ethic and their inherited religious values together for a while. And then they reach a point where there's enough of a diversion that either they feel they have to make a choice, or they just feel that their old religious ethic has dried up and withered away. And they're just going to let it fall by the wayside and go with what they think their real power is. Now, that's a description of 80 odd people, but I thought in some ways he encapsulated something important about our culture. And so I ended up thinking, what does that mean about how we got here and where we might go next?
Thank you, Alec. And I suppose then, from your perspective, Paul, when you look at the time that we find ourselves in now, so recently there's been a lot of furore in the USA and elsewhere about Nick Fuentes and the fact that he's been platformed by folks like Tucker Carlson, and some of these ideas are coming into the mainstream. I think very much in line with Alec's thesis, and there is this determination to strip back the taboos about Hitler and so on, and just see him as one evil dictator amongst many. Uh, but there's this kind of localized quality to it that's, with those white identitarians and with the kind of woke left. And you've spoken, Paul, about the limitations of kind of wokeism as an ideology and how lasting you thought it would be. Whereas Alec, you offer this picture of the kind of universalist nature of this anti-Nazi, anti-fascist moral imagination. I wonder if you might maybe draw a contrast between those two, and maybe why is that so abiding, or has it been so abiding for so long? Maybe where do you foresee things going next? Should we start with you, Paul?
Well, I was just a pastor minding his own business, interested in things, and then I decided to play with YouTube, and so then a few thousand people found me, and sort of changed a bunch of things about my life. And a lot of that had been in the context of I was very interested in what was happening around Jordan Peterson because most of my life, at least in the Christian Reformed Church, where I'm a minister, in the communities, in my generation and successive generations, I had noted a lot of what Alec just described, Colin Brown just describing, in terms of not people sort of converting out of the church, but a number of people just saying, this bit about Jesus and stuff, we don't really need that because the heart of it is over here.
Mm.
And then I watched in my own denomination in the 20 teens, revving up to 2002 to 2005, where the Christian Reformed Church had this dramatic wrestling with issues like same-sex marriage, which has sort of visited all of the Protestant denominations in one form or another. I saw the rise of what we now call wokeness, and having been raised in a racial reconciliation church, mostly African Americans in Paterson, New Jersey, pastoring a multi-ethnic church in a very diverse community in Sacramento, California, I saw wokeism. I thought so much of what is sort of being promoted here just doesn't stand up to life on the ground because I had lived, with African American communities my entire life. That had been the focus of my father's ministry. I'd done a tremendous amount of work on it, and I was watching this and saying, a lot of this wokish stuff don't really know African American people at all on the ground. And so I didn't think it was going to last very long because it just couldn't. It just wasn't true enough. But the more enduring elements of of a certain default religion, of certain segments of American society. And it's important to recognize that this is mostly dominant in certain segments of American society. Again, because of a lot of my work with poor, homeless, marginalized communities, I knew that they have very different filters. And that, before I had come across Alec's book, I was deeply appreciating how, let's say, the UN Declaration of human rights was sort of dominating the moral imagination. I also spent a fair amount of time thinking about how this American civil rights movement played as the American civil rights movement for the United States, and I think to a certain degree via Americanization in Europe, was this it really was another revival in terms of the great revivals of American history, where the moral imagination of an entire population was just transformed and cemented, and making for many people what's happening in the church rather incidental. A lot of this came through in the emerging church movement, which sort of came after the seeker movement, where people began to be skeptical about some of the instrumentality of certain evangelical practices and rituals in America, asking deeper questions. And that thing sort of fragmented. And some of what we're seeing now in terms of characters, counter narrative characters. I mean, Jordan Peterson was kind of an early one, but many who had sort of been ensconced in this tradition beginning to doubt and pointing out aspects of it that are giving way. And especially, I think, fueled by social media, it's sort of becoming a landslide where many of these assumptions, while not completely abandoned, are, as Alec just said, once again now visible to us. And again, I think the work of Tom Holland was in his book Dominion was incredibly important to that. And as I watched in sort of the late 20 teens up to 2020, Jordan Peterson having a big impact on people. Then when I started listening to the conversion stories of high profile people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, suddenly Dominion comes into those narratives, Tom Holland's book there, because beginning to see, oh yes, we can certainly embrace these ideas of human rights and those assumptions. But for a long time, Tom Holland had been pointing out that there's nothing really tremendously scientifically verifiable about human rights when you've sort of categorized all human beings as, impressively trousered apes, as C.S. Lewis calls them, mockingly to the others. So this has been in process for a while, and we're going to continue to see, especially in a social media environment where in an attention economy, you can become wealthy and famous just by being counter narrative, especially if I mean, some of the earlier chapters in Alec's book about, unbelief, where in the medieval period, you've got these atheists who pop up and they're just fun and dramatic because they're just sort of the troll trying to poke their finger in the eye of the religious assumption. So we're going to have plenty of people playing that game now. But the important thing to watch is, I think, for many of us, the concern, okay, what happens? I think we've benefited from a lot of this these inherited invisible assumptions within our culture that, as Tom Holland had pointed out, are really come to us through Christian civilization. Once they continue to depart, some of the some of the kinds of things that you'd see in Nazi ideology will begin to emerge. That people will increasingly say, why should we prioritize human beings? What about human life should be treated as sacred? And I think, yeah, that will, I suspect, fearfully become a rather scary thing to watch. And I think we've already seen it in terms of, questions around abortion, and you're just watching these things continue to sort of eat at the assumptions, and it's going to continue.
Would you like to speak to that, Alec?
I, yeah, I mean, I find that a really powerful analysis in all kinds of ways. I mean, my own view of the woke phenomenon, or the way that the way that it's played out after that kind of moment of flowering it had in the very late teens. Um, I suppose I kind of regard it with a degree of compassion, if that doesn't sound too patronizing. Um, in that it feels like a move born out of desperation. This is an act of moral brittleness, um, made by a movement which, in the kind of broader sense of secular progressivism, which had thought it owned the future, and then finds that the future isn't behaving the way it was supposed to. And in the way of every sociopolitical movement that finds that it's rejected, its first instinct is to double down. Okay, so you don't want ham and eggs, so how about double ham and eggs? And there's you can see that in a lot of the kind of classic work preoccupations, but in a range of other areas as well. The increasingly kind of shrill, brittle way that a lot of folks on the progressive side have responded to the lurches in our popular culture, and the readiness to shout Nazi, to paint that, like, to assume that what we are living through is basically a rerun of the 1920s and 30s, is just a pervasive feature of it. And I mean, plainly, that's not the case. Just because history doesn't repeat itself, there are a bunch of ugly things going on in the world right now, but they're different from the ones that were going on back then. And the attempt to read everything through that lens just to fight the last war, it just seems to me foolish. Not least because it seems to me one of the most important lessons of looking at the 20s and 30s is that an awful lot of people then had their eye on the wrong problem. The focus was absolutely that communism, Bolshevism was the great threat. I mean, not that they were wrong to identify the evils of Bolshevism, but that wasn't what was going to tear the world down, and impose the bloodiest conflict the world's ever seen. Um, and our fixation on fighting the last war on that old set of problems, I think could easily be leading us to miss some more serious stuff, because evil wears more faces than just that one. I mean, having said that, I mean, I've been kind of depressed, though I shouldn't, as a historian, be surprised by the fact that as we enter this period of moral flux, as those nice, comforting certainties that many of us have been so disorientated by the dissolution of, as they start to fall away, what's going to be the most obvious sign of that kind of chaos in a culture that comes out of European Christendom? It's that people on both the left and the right are going to find a way to blame the Jews. And that resurgence of the most perennial Christian rooted prejudice, in both the whole Fuentes thing and that that I think quite small but really toxically concentrated presence of that on the right, and then the much more distributed and somewhat more nuanced way that the state of Israel has been reclassified from iconic victim to iconic villain for many people on the left. It's hard not to see these two things as parallels and as signs that that nice consensus, nice depending on how much you like it, that that implicit religion within which we've lived, um, the wheels are coming off this, and so in that sense, wokeism seems to me a kind of a moment of churn, as some of the most rigid defenders of that consensus, or one version of it, try to hold on to it and preserve it by doubling down. And I mean, whether you agree with them or not, it's not working.
And Paul, if you don't want to go down some route of your own, of course jump in at any point and go whichever direction you wish. But from my perspective, I'm kind of curious. Alec mentioned, and you mentioned actually the influence of Tom Holland's Dominion, and it's not just in the realm of ideas, sort of disembodied. It has this practical import. It informs how we perceive art and all those different things, and Alec gives examples of the anti-Nazi sort of manifestation of that, as a maybe alternative in some ways, or maybe as an accompaniment to the Holland's Christianized elements. And from my perspective, I've been deeply impressed by a worldview thinking as a Christian, Nancy Pearcey, how she looks at art and that kind of thing, and not just taking these things as neutral or something that we can just engage with in a consumerist mindset. You have to be critical and wrestle with the arts and so on. I suppose in line with what Alex describing there, as we move into the 21st century and we're saturated with these images, and there's a greater panoply of images now in the 21st century than there ever was with the digital media. Would you have any pastoral advice or concerns that you'd like to share about how we might think and feel and engage Christianly with the arts, if that makes sense?
Well, so as you know, Marcus, when things started rolling around me in 2017, 2018, I became friends with Jonathan Peugeot, an Orthodox icon carver, John Vervaeke, a cognitive scientist out of University of Toronto, and we began, talking about many of these issues just before we Alec joined us. Marcus and I were talking about some changes in Marcus's life in terms of where what he's thinking through, and I use this word that I coined metagelical, which seems to be this very fluid space right now in which many Christians find themselves. So, myself as a product of the Dutch Calvinist tradition, befriending a someone who grew up Quebecois, from a Dallas Theological Seminary trained father, pastor, becomes Orthodox and carves icons. We're living in that kind of fluid presence where many of the traditional walls between Christian silos are melting down, and many of the artifacts of that separation, let's say iconography for one, use of images, these things are sort of recessing. At the same time, to Alec talk now, when you think about the future is always a very strange place. The more I read, the more I pondered the question of the age of Hitler, the more it sort of forced me back into Wilson and Paris 1919
Hmm.
and what was happening there, and then also into 1848 and the tumultuous changes within Europe at that time, where in this long 19th century, you have really the destruction of an entire world with many of its assumptions. Now, the United States was a bit different, and those contrasts can very clearly be seen in Paris in 1919, where Wilson is sort of bringing a Protestant modernist um, agenda to Europe to try to get rid of the absolutists, as they were called. France, of course, had been, going back and forth in that. The UK has its own strange mix of old and new, while you still have the fall of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. You have this disassembling of worlds, and so much of what I see now. I had sent an email previous to Alec about the kinds of conferences that we're doing in one of our conferences in Chino, California. After the conference itself, where we have the strange combination of myself, Jonathan Peugeot, and John Vervaeke trying to get our minds around what's going on. We had a little field trip to the Orthodox Church after the conference on Sunday afternoon, and in the corner of the church there's a box, and it's full of relics, and these young men are bending over kissing the box, who had just been at the conference. And I thought about just how strange it was that, because I had talked with many of these men on my channel over the years, how many of these men 5 years ago had been devotees of Sam Harris, and now they're on their knees on granite kissing a box of dead men's bones. And I thought, whenever we move into the future, we can't help but try to selectively bring some things from the past. And so inevitably, there's always sort of a tick-tock of the future. We seldom appropriate the direct past, like our parents. We often appropriate our great-grandparents' world. But of course, it's never the same when we bring it forward into our world. And so what we're seeing in this current uptick of passion around the church again is we're seeing Latin Mass Catholics, we're seeing interest in orthodoxy, interest in iconography, and I would imagine someone 200 years from now probably wouldn't say, the fact that almost all of these people are spending more and more of their lives watching screens, why would it be a surprise that they would choose a church that is imagistic over, let's say, a very plain tradition like my own? I've seen many artists grow up in American Protestantism only to seemingly have to go Orthodox or Catholic simply because the Protestant iconoclasm left them bereft of anything to do with their God-given gifts. So it's going to be really fascinating to watch how, as this one very powerful implicit religion recedes, what people sort of go into the basement for to bring back up and begin mixing and matching on their walls. And I think, in terms of what I've done on my channel and what I've done with my conferences, that's basically what I've seen. People have moved from Sam Harris to orthodoxy. And it's a fascinating thing to watch.
That's a really interesting and actually really encouraging story to hear. Thank you, Paul. Um, Now, I mean, I'm an old Calvinist fellow traveler. I'm the last person that you would ask for to say anything intelligent about art. Um, but well, I can say why I find that encouraging. Because as you say, it's this process of going into the basement and bringing out what's there. So in that sense, it's a moment of what the Catholics would call ressourcement. Of finding out what we have in our tradition, or even the bits of the tradition that we left behind and can bring out. But it is also being done in quite a radically new way. And there are plenty of folks who were born and bred within the Orthodox or the Catholic traditions who are pretty uneasy about how some of this is happening. And to them it looks very Protestant. And this attempt to just come in and take the bits that you like. And I mean, you can be sniffy about that as consumerism if you like. Um, I've got a more positive view of it in that it's showing maybe that the providential process of secularization that we've been through over the past few centuries was worth some of the trouble. Um, I think we can still forget, maybe in Europe, it's more obviously in our face, uh, just how deep some of the problems of the old Christendom ran, and the how far we were going to have to go in order to purge those out. Um, and you don't need to go into the full kind of Anabaptist mode that Hauerwas and some others have gone to recognize. We need to work out, those of us who want to hang on to a Christian identity, not just to hang on to it, but to reinvent it, to work out actually what it should be. And it seems to me, I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted, rather than just um, having a set of observations about our own implicit religion, actually to write a book about where it might be going, was to say we need to draw on the resources that we learned the hard way from the disasters of the middle of the 20th century. Um, they're not enough, and we've seen, I think, that the proposal that they might be enough to base a social ethic on kind of testing itself to destruction. Um, but we do need them, and it's in particular the thing that ethic brings. And it's an ethic which I think is you know I was going to say profoundly compatible with Christianity. I want to put it more strongly than that. Um, is its ability to get people of different worldviews to play nicely together and to respect one another's space. Um, and the ability that gives to Christians to be able to look at one another's traditions and appreciate the value that they might have for them without needing just to build the fences and line them with barbed wire in the traditional way. Um, that seems to me one of the signs that the process of ressourcement and of drawing together the best of our hard-learned recent lessons and the deeper traditions that we're going to have to draw on, that it's actually happening. So thank you.
Yeah.
You've cheered me up this evening.
Well, I am tremendously optimistic. I think, you're a reformational historian. Many, like Lewis, Lewis
Mhm.
commented about the Reformation, wishes it hadn't gone the way it did. And I think any reading of the various reformations, as is true of human beings, we can really muck things up quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, we're good at that.
And and it's funny because, part of what I've seen in the American Christian world is, I mean, Americans are very fast appropriators of all sorts of things. I mean, we're the consummate consumers. If something grabs our attention, we tend to grab it. We don't ask too many questions. We grab, we start to play. And even, even what's been, happening with Anglicanism is fascinating because in some ways, Anglicanism right now, on one hand, is a very interesting space for a lot of American Protestants, evangelicals who are looking because they're saying, well, here's a tradition that you can sort of have it all.
Mhm.
You can have sacramentality. You can have embodiment in images and in ritual and liturgy. You can do all of this. You can have a rich theological tradition. And so, wow, there's a lot of promise there. And at the same time, Anglicanism is in some ways never, it's continuing to tear itself apart and find, okay, so the many of the heirs of it in Africa are saying, no, we're the true Anglicans, and thanks, but I really appreciate what you gave us. You seem to be abandoning it, but we'll keep it just fine, thank you. And that's just sort of a small image, I think, of what's happening. I look at immigrants to it. There's a Ukrainian. If you look in Sacramento, for example, most of the Ukrainians are Pentecostals.
Mhm.
At the same time that a few of the young men coming to me through the Jordan Peterson period went Orthodox. And I remember speaking with one Greek immigrant in one of our Christian Reformed churches who was delightful to find in that Christian Reformed church weekly communion and a sense of liturgy and the Eucharist, but not all of that other stuff embedded with orthodoxy in the Greece that he left. And so I do believe that secularization was, and I think still has been, in many ways, a real blessing for the world in a very subtle way by which many of the blessings of Christ could be transmitted and sort of smuggled into cultures and peoples and given a gift of saying, hmm, um, we don't have to resolve all of our feuds with bloodshed. We can look for ways of working together. Now, of course, liberalism itself and secularism is being tested and debated. And I think that debate is good, but as with so many things, I don't think it's really going away as much as many, especially let's say in certain Roman Catholic groups, say they're trying to be post-liberal, and it's like, yeah, I don't see the Roman Catholic Church becoming the state church of the United States, no matter how many shrines of Pope John Paul you build in Washington, D.C. It's not happening. And so, we continue to be in a very messy period, but I think there's a lot of reason to be very hopeful about it.
I mean, yeah, you say messy. I mean, sure, but in some ways, I think messiness is authentically Christian. Um, there's a kind of tidiness that is there as well, I think it's a temptation in some Christian minds, which is not unlike the kind of temptations that I think you can see in some of the woke spirit of, oh, if we can just get past this moment of madness, this century of madness, and then normal service will resume, and we can restore a Christian-dominated society, a Catholic-dominated society. Um, but I mean, one thing I can pretty confidently tell you as a historian is that's not how time works. Uh, whatever's going to happen, it will have echoes. It'll draw on that on the basement, on your great grandfather's wisdom, but it won't be a reversion to it. Um, I mean, if there's one constant scriptural promise, it's behold, I do something new. And I think we need to be looking for what the new thing is, and what we're called to in this moment, rather than. Uh, I mean, I suppose as a historian, I should be keen on people looking for historical models, um, and and not only regarding them as terrible warnings. There is resource more to be had there,
Yeah.
but it's a kaleidoscope. It's
Yeah.
got to be recombined in a new way.
Molly Worthen, who's my dream conference was to get Alex Ryrie and Molly Worthen together on stage, because you'd get Molly just wrote she's just become a professing Christian, an American evangelical of all things, which of course surprises people because aren't scholars supposed to become Anglican or something? And she's just written this book Spellbound, which is a wonderful tour through just in many ways some of the chaotic religious insanity of American sort of fringe church history. I mean,
Hmm.
it's full of all kinds of characters, but of course Europe has plenty of the same. Um, and fortunately, in a lot of American history, obviously with the exception of the American Civil War, isn't nearly as bloody as some of the older history in Europe with respect to some of these religious movements. But when you read a history like that, you begin to recognize that it is, yeah, it's not tidy. It is messy. New things come about. But what's amazing to me is how durable the Christian faith has remained. Granted, it's sometimes difficult for each individual tradition to sort of maintain their thread, whether confessionally or liturgically or in what other way they're trying to sort of maintain that thread. But I think we do see Christ and his spirit moving through churches and moving through movements and moving through people, and even in astoundingly complex ways, in sort of a gravitational way of taking all of this chaos, but things just continue to sort of move towards the center who is Christ in time. Richard Mao, in the American context, you can see some, groups like the Seventh-day Adventist getting
Mm.
increasingly evangelical. Richard Mao, who's from, my tradition, has been, he's getting up there in age, but he spent a fair amount of time talking to the Latter-day Saints, just trying to continue to build bridges. And the thinking being at some point, even the Latter-day Saints will probably continue to feel that gravity of moving towards this great Christian tradition. So I think historically um, that has been the case. And again, I think it's reason for optimism.
I very much see that pattern. I'm personally very fond of the SDAs, and I've been touched by what I've seen some of within that tradition. I I even think there's some movements of the kind of direction that you talk about amongst some in the Jehovah's Witnesses, which obviously there's a very particular history there. Um, Now, I mean, maybe it's the point of the conversation where I ought to out myself as an Anglican. Although the Church of England is something different, it does actually make a kind of attempt to be an inclusive national church, uh, which doesn't work, and it doesn't work in a really interesting and fruitful way, I think. Um, so, I mean, I've pledged canonical obedience to the Bishop of Newcastle with kind of sort of my fingers crossed behind my back, at least with a narrow interpretation of what canonical obedience might mean. But my what I've said to folks within within this context, and I think applies more widely, especially to people in the more hierarchical churches. Um, I think the most important scriptural command to church leaders is don't quench the spirit. That where there have been movements for renewal of all kinds, within across the whole history of Christianity, they tend not to come from the top, from hierarchical leadership, and the role of hierarchies and structures, and it's a really important role, is one of discernment, of recognizing what's going on at the ground level, what the Spirit is doing amongst the churches, and where the Spirit is at work to encourage and protect it and guide it, and where it's not, or where there are the problems are becoming too serious to channel it and divert it into a different direction. The problem that I think my denomination is actually quite seriously prey to, and I'm sure the same is true of many others, is of church leaders who see a set of problems, secularization or whatever, and think it's their job to solve them. Um, and that can lead to people claiming a prophetic status for themselves because they can see that a prophet is what's needed. Um, but just because a prophet is needed doesn't mean that you're it. Uh, and that willingness to leap into what you think the future might be, rather than to wait to see where the Spirit might be taking you, has caused some trouble, and continues to do so.
Suppose then by way of models, as you're both speaking, at a number of points, I thought that C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were two wonderful examples, not just for their own respective works, but even their friendship and the fact that, in line with your book, Alec, there were goods within that anti-Nazi element, but then there's this positive vision on the other side that wasn't enough. But these two men came out of the First World War and the Second World War and offered this wonderful Christian wisdom distilled in terms of apologetics, in terms of the arts in different ways, and so on. I wonder if you want to speak to those and that mere Christian element, and either them specifically or other figures like that who you think might serve as models who didn't position themselves in that role of prophetic figures or whatever, but did serve that purpose, and we can look back now after the fact and say, "Oh, that they were the right people for the right time," and so on. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. There's always a way in which there's sort of a natural selection because obviously they were. I mean, Tolkien and Lewis, I mean, giants of the moment. It'll be interesting to see how I loved what you pointed out in terms of Tolkien in your book and in some of the lectures around your book that he in some ways wrote the war he wished we could have had instead of the war that we did. And both Lewis and Tolkien obviously survived, unlike many of, the best and the brightest of England, survived the war. And so I think part of it'll be interesting the degree to which their work will also be tied to we don't quite have the language around it now. We could call it the post-war consensus. I particularly like sort of the universal four freedoms religion, which I sort of borrow from when you pointed out Roosevelt's. I looked up and read and listened to Roosevelt's speech in January of 1941, where he's trying to, convince Congress to not just have a cash and carry basis with England, but actually lend lease. They don't have the
Mhm.
money now. Give them America Roosevelt trying to get us into the war with a nation that won't until, of course, Pearl Harbor. So it'll be interesting to the degree to which Tolkien and Lewis are bound into this 20th century period because, I mean, both Tolkien and Lewis were men of their times and, tremendously prescient and have had incredible careers of influence now. But it'll be interesting when, as this post-war consensus sort of continues to recede, if they'll have sort of this amazing ability to speak to people indirectly that they've had over the last 30 years. So I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, it's a really I know it's an important question, but it's one that matters a lot to me. I mean, I've got always so much Lewis in my head, and have had since I was a teenager and before. Um, and the two men. I mean, despite their being friends and their lives being intertwined in so many ways, they're so different from each other. And I mean, you were saying, Paul, they're men of their times, which I mean, of course they are, but in some ways they sit quite lightly to their times. Tolkien, in some sense, he really belongs in the seventh century. There's something kind of profoundly Nordic about him. Um, and Lewis has this sort of deeply medieval quality to him as well. I mean, my suspicion is that it's Tolkien, despite the fact that he is a profoundly conservative person in his own time, and he is out of step with his age, and very much sees himself as being, and is seen by it as being. He's this crazy old man writing myths, inventing languages. Um, my suspicion is that in the end is going to be the influence that runs deeper because the myth is so powerful and is so lightly rooted in its time. He's mixing in an enormous dose of early medieval wisdom while refracting it through an unmistakably 20th century ethic. Um, I mean, the job that he's doing in The Hobbit of taking this, essentially 1930s Englishman, in the shape of Bilbo, and introducing him to a world which has so much more grandeur and terror and beauty in it than he could have imagined. I mean, that's the gift that he's giving to his own age and to ours as well. And so for all I love Lewis as a thinker and as a polemicist, and the kind of joyfulness that he's capable of, as well as the street fighter, which you can see the kind of the Ulster barrister coming through in him. Um, my suspicion, and I think actually it is best in his less grumpy moments, Lewis would recognize this too. It's the scale and the emotional power of the vision that Tolkien has created, um, that's going to endure. There's a reason why that's the mythology that people want to keep reworking and reinventing, some with some effects better than others. Whereas nobody's ever really managed to do anything very effectively with the Narnia books. I mean, partly because I think the books are almost a complete perfection in themselves, but it's difficult to see that mythology being extended. Who knows? Maybe once they're out of copyright.
Oh, that'll be wild.
Uh, actually not. Well, yeah, yeah, no, there's something there that I can't talk about, but it may not be too long.
Oh,
Oh, wonderful. That's most exciting. Thank you so much, gents. We're coming to the end of our time for this evening, unfortunately, but alongside that project or a little piece that you can't mention, are there any things that you can and would like to mention? Upcoming projects, Paul, you've mentioned different events and such. Would you like to speak to any of those and where
yeah,
people?
we don't have any dates for next conferences yet. But anybody who's curious about estuary or my project, there's always my YouTube channel, and I'm on YouTube and I'm on Twitter. Those are basically the only two places that I sort of play around in. And yeah, so we'll see. There'll be more estuary conferences. There are some of them in the works, but dates aren't set, and but the more will come.
Wonderful.
I-
And
I'm
Sean?
I'm happy to say I don't have a social media life, but I do have a book coming out in April of next year, which is going to be called The World's Reformation, which was originally supposed to be a short essay about why Protestants didn't do global mission during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and has since turned into an enormous book explaining that they did, and that there is a whole missionary history of that era which hasn't properly been told. And I don't know if it's properly been told now, but I've given it a go. Um,
Wow.
uh, so yeah, I mean that was a project that got out of control. And then I'm also going to be giving a series of public lectures in Cambridge in England in May next year on the theme of Christianity and suffering. So that'll be a barrel of laughs.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, gents. I most appreciate your time. And God willing, you can make that conference happen and bring Molly Worthen in on it. And I'm sure it'll be a blessing for many. And all the best to you both in your
It's a
respective
day.
ministries, gents.
All right. Thank you, Marcus.
Bless you all.
Thank you.
I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there. Don't you wanna go too? I'm going there.
More Christ is sponsored by Sheer Blooms. Sheer Blooms is a flower preservation specialist. If you live in Britain or Ireland and wish to have your flowers preserved for special occasions, then please follow the details on your screen. If you'd like to join us in the Patreon community, you'll get early access to new episodes, you'll receive free ebooks, and you get the chance to ask some of my guests your questions.